guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today, we're going to be going over this. So, there's just a few cool things we're going to cover today. We're going to start off with cutting off your friend's head and separating it from the background. Then we're going to get into the main dish. The actual main part I would like you to take away from this is the interesting use of element to create the blisters on your actor's face, as well as the 3D tracked mat that we're going to use to control the burning away of the skin. And then of course the obvious use of element, which is our 3D skull. And then before the day is done, I'm going to briefly go over how you can add some glow under the skin and some embers with particular. And then we're going to composite in a little bit of stock footage with Action Essentials. This is actually a really popular technique known throughout the visual effects community as the Ken Burns effect. And let's stop wasting time and get right into it. Alright, so here we are in Adobe After Effects. As you can see, I already have my footage imported and trimmed to the length we're going to be working with. I have a clean plate on the background as well, if you toggle that on and off. I just painted this real quick in Photoshop. It's not perfect, but it will do. The first thing I'm going to do is separate his head from his shoulders here, and add back in the back of the jacket and the inside of the shirt where it would be if he was actually headless and hollow. So let's start with tracking this. I'm going to create a new null object. Now I'm going to select my footage. Over here, open up the tracker and click track motion, and we're also going to track rotation. I have 2 points picked out here. The first one is over here on his right side, this tiny little glow spot. We can turn down the search area just so it goes quicker. And then we can also make this maybe a little bit smaller as well. And over here on this side, I'm just going to be using the tip of this little shoulder piece on his leather jacket. That looks pretty good, so we're going to go ahead and track forward. Alright, so once your track has finished and you don't see any visible errors, we can go ahead and click Edit Target, choose Null 1, the one that we had already created, click OK, and then Apply to X and Y. I'm going to close some of these just so it's a little prettier down here. And now if you see, we have a null that correctly fits to his shoulders and rotates the way it should. Alright, now moving on, we're going to remove the head. So we need to select our footage, hit Control D on the keyboard to duplicate it. Now we're going to create a new solid. Make the solid black, and I'm going to call this matte. Now I'm going to turn off the visibility for matte as well as our footage layer that's underneath our first one. And click the pen tool with matte selected. We're going to draw a mask around the shirt collar here. We don't want any of the hair in. Out and around the head with ample room. Back down and around the other side. To make sure you don't have any skin spilling into the mask, you can turn on the visibility for matte and toggle on and off with this button here the visibility of the mask outline itself. And yeah, you can definitely tell I have a little bit here visible, and that just won't do. So we're going to have to go back in and refine where our edges line up. The other thing you can do is if it is showing through just a little bit on every single side, you can hit MM on the keyboard, so M 2 times, and then turn up the mask expansion, maybe 2 pixels. Now what we can do is toggle the switches on the bottom with this button here until you see the track matte. And then with our top footage, the one that's still visible, selected, we can change its track matte to alpha inverted matte. So essentially what that has done is it has told our footage layer that it can be visible everywhere except for where this matte is visible, which is why we drew the mask around the shirt collar and the head, so it knows what to get rid of. Now with our matte selected here, on the very first frame where we know it lines up, we can parent it to our null. And if you scrub through here, you can see that it sticks pretty well, but there may be little cases where it pokes out from underneath. And in that instance, what you can actually do is click the stopwatch for mask path, and then go through and make adjustments where it is needed. Also be careful, it looks like here by the end a little bit of the hair is coming down into the visibility zone, so I'm just going to pull the mask a little bit wider to get rid of that. So there we go, our actor is officially headless. Okay, so now the next thing we want to do is add back in the collar of the jacket and the inside of our shirt. The way to do that is I'm actually going to select the footage layer, the first one that we used, and duplicate it one more time. I'm going to rename this to collar. And then on the first frame, I'm going to right-click, go to Time, and Freeze Frame. Now, with our pen tool selected, I'm going to draw a mask around this portion right here. That looks pretty good. Now, we can turn back on the visibility of the collar layer if you haven't done so already. And then with the anchor point tool selected, I'm just going to move that down somewhere where it's roughly centered again. Now what I can do is rotate it and move it into position right about here. And I'm going to put it just above the mat. The other thing we can do is, so that way this highlight is on the correct side, if you notice. I'm going to right-click, transform, and flip vertically. Now what we have is our highlights here lining up pretty well. I'm going to let those slightly cascade out. That looks pretty good. I'm going to rotate this up just a little more. All right, that lines up pretty well. Now what we're actually going to do is the exact same thing to the other side here. So I'm going to select my second footage layer, duplicate it one more time, and with the pen tool selected, I'm going to draw a mask just around the edge of the collar in a similar fashion to the other one that we drew on. Now we can rename this. I'm going to call this collar 2. Turn on the visibility. Take the anchor point tool. I'm going to move the anchor point to the center just so it's easier to work with. I'm going to move it over here. Put it just above our first collar layer. And rotate it. And I almost forgot we need to freeze frame it as well. So time, freeze frame. And we can actually stretch this one out a bit just so we can get them to connect. Maybe we can do that to this one a little bit as well. We just want them to meet in the middle in a realistic shape that looks like it would be hugging the back of our actor's neck. And now for both of them, I'm going to add a feather amount to maybe about 2 or 3 pixels. Now the cool thing about this is we're going to have a skull and a spine and lots of fire and smoke and embers. So as long as this looks fairly accurate, it's going to do just fine for this effect. There's no need to break your back over making it look absolutely perfect, because the heat distortion and the stock footage are really going to make this blend nicely in the end. I'd just say overall the most important part is getting your tracking solid. Now what we can do next is select both of our collar layers and then choose Layer, Pre-Compose, and I'm just going to call this Collar Comp. And with our collar composition selected, we can parent it to our null. Now if you go through, you see it will line up pretty well, but not perfectly. So the way we can fix that is just hit P on the keyboard, and then click the stopwatch, and go through and animate its position as needed. We have a small issue here where we had our mask retract. Can you guys hear that in the background? I have some noisy cats. There's actually this really cool service my local vet offers to make cats more quiet. Essentially what you do is you take them there and then she'll just keep them. And so let's fix this collar real quick. So what we can do is maybe even go back into our collar composition. And for this side here, we can maybe duplicate it one more time. And let's move it down some and rotate it. And I want it to be a little bit thicker, so maybe we can do this with it. And let's put it underneath. And, rotate it just a tad more. Change its mask so it lines up nicely, and I think that looks pretty good. If we scrub through here, that works out just fine. All right, and now the next step is actually the easy part. We need to add back in the inside of our actor's t-shirt. So the way to do that is create a new solid, Control Y on the keyboard, and I'm just going to call this inner shirt. And now I'm going to put this below our footage that has the matte applied to it, and draw a quick mask, kind of roughly tracing the shape that we need it to. All right, and that looks pretty good. And what I'm going to do is parent it to our null, scrub through, make sure it lines up pretty well. That's perfect. Now, the reason I didn't specify which color I wanted this solid to be before we set it up is because it doesn't matter. I'm going to apply an effect on top of it anyway that's called gradient ramp. And then I'm going to change from linear ramp to radial ramp. And what I want to do is have the color gradually change from one side of the inside of the shirt to the other. Because if you think about it realistically, the light is coming from over here where my cursor is. And so therefore, it wouldn't really be hitting the inside of the t-shirt where this collar is blocking out the light. But as it gets closer to here on the left side, you might have a little bit more light spilling in. So there would be a gradual color change. And this gradient ramp effect is going to help us fake that. So for the start color, what I'm going to do is pick the color of my t-shirt and then open up the color editor and make it quite a bit darker. So somewhere about right there. And then for the end color, I'm going to do the same thing where we pick the color of the t-shirt. I think that looks really good. It's giving us a little bit of dimension, except for the fact that our footage is a little bit soft and has a lot of this noise, except for right here on the inside. So what we need to do is add some of that grain back in. So with our inner shirt layer selected, we can add an effect called Add Grain. Then I need to change the viewing mode from preview to final output. Now I'm going to change the intensity down to about 0.25 and the softness up to about 1.2. All right, and I think that matches quite nicely. I actually want to give you guys an interesting idea. If you turn on the footage that we have down here and put it above everything, you can actually play with the opacity. So that way you could have like a sort of translucent guy, or maybe even animate it to go from 100 to 0. So that way you have him slowly disappearing and you can still see the inside of his shirt there. But this is only the first half of it, the ghost portion of the Ghost Rider effect, if you will. So let's keep moving on. The next thing that we're going to be covering is our 3D tracked matte to get his head to disappear in a really interesting way. So let me just turn off the animation and put this back where it needs to go, and we can keep moving on. So the next thing to do is grab our footage, the layer we haven't touched yet, and duplicate it one more time. Now I'm going to pre-compose it, move all attributes into new composition, and I'm going to name this head matte. Okay, so now we can double click on that composition. With our footage selected, grab the pen tool and create a mask right around our actor's jawline and getting some of his hair in there as well. This doesn't have to be too exact. Okay, that looks good. Now I'm going to hit M on the keyboard and click the stopwatch for mask path and move forward throughout the timeline and animate this mask. So that way we roughly just get his head and hair and not any of the background or his neck. All right, now that we have that, I'm going to select our footage. We're going to pre-compose it one more time, again, moving all attributes into a new composition. And then we can click on the 3D camera tracker. So with the tracker window open and the composition selected, we can click Track Camera. So I want to take a moment to explain exactly what this is doing. Essentially, what I've done is I've told the 3D camera tracker with our mask and pre-composition to ignore everything except for his head. And the reason we do that is it essentially will trick our 3D camera tracker into thinking that it's orbiting around the head, as opposed to the head just rotating on its own axis. So let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to click on the Create Camera button, and then I'm going to grab an area here on the head, and then choose Create Solid. And now if you see, the solid is fairly accurately tracked to our actor's head. This is going to be very useful for our Element 3D layer as we're adding our skull and for our next step, the 3D tracked matte. So I'm going to delete that solid, and we can get right into it. So before adding our element 3D layer, I'm actually going to create the texture that we're going to use for our tracked matte. So we're going to go Layer, New, Solid, and I'm going to name this Fractal, and we're going to apply a fractal noise effect on top of it. And then for the fractal type, I'm going to change it to Dynamic, then turn up the contrast quite a bit. Then we're going to change the brightness all the way down until you can't see any white at all. So about 180. And then keyframe the brightness by clicking the stopwatch. Move to the about 3/4 of the way through mark of the composition and set it all the way up until all it is white. We may want to go back and refine this later. However, for the time being, this is going to work just fine. So select your fractal layer. We're going to pre-compose it. Move all attributes to New Comp, name this Texture, and then click OK. Now we can move our texture below our head composition here and turn off its visibility. Now next we're going to create another new solid, and I'm going to name this Element, and of course apply Element 3D to it as an effect. Now here in the Scene Setup, we're going to click the Import button, and I have a male head model. Click OK. In the description below this video, you will be able to download the project file, which will include this model. So I'm going to scale it up just a touch, and then click OK. And then we're going to create a group null for group 1, and I'm going to rename this Head Control. Select our footage with the 3D Camera Tracker effect applied, and grab a null that's somewhere on his forehead. Right-click on it and choose Create Null. Now what we can do to this null is select it and hit P on the keyboard to bring up its position information. And then we're going to click on the position and copy it with Control-C and paste it onto the position information of our head control. So as you can see, it's way back there. So what we're going to need to do is hit S and change the scale of our head until it about matches the scale of our actor's head. And if we want, we can click our Element 3D layer and just turn the opacity down a little so we can see how well it's lining up. Select the head control and move it down some, and scale it down just a little bit, and rotate it to the right, and down just a touch. This doesn't have to be perfect, but we want the eyes, nose, and mouth to line up as best as we can get them to. All right, now that looks pretty good to me. Now, I've been working in about the middle frame because I think this is a good rest pose to stop at. So at this frame right here, I'm going to hit P, Shift, R to bring up the position and rotation information of our head-controlled null at the same time. I'm going to click the stopwatch for both the position and orientation. And if we scrub through, we can see that the head is tracked fairly well, but the rotation is a little bit off, which is as to be expected as the tracking technique we're using doesn't always work exactly perfectly. But what we do have is a 3D moving camera, which will allow us to place objects and things on our actor's head with a little bit of work involved. So right here, it looks pretty good. If we scrub backwards, it looks like it's tracked pretty well, except there's a little bit of rotation at the end here. Might want to change the orientation just a hair. That looks good. And let's go to the end right about here. And I'm going to change the orientation and position. So that looks pretty good, except for the fact that his head turn finishes a little bit before ours does. So I'm going to move this keyframe back, change it to Easy Ease In. And then right here, I actually want to change this to Easy Ease Out. And then I'm going to click on the graph editor. And on this little graph option down here, change it to Edit Speed Graph if it isn't already. Now what we can do is grab this little yellow Bezier curve and move it forward so that way he begins to turn fast just like he does in real life. I'm going to actually move these keyframes in just a hair. And I'm going to move these ones in so all the speed is happening right in the middle. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how it has turned out. It's not perfect, but it's going to work just fine for what we need it for. So now with our Element 3D layer selected, we can go to Custom Layers, and then under Custom Texture Maps, change Layer 1 to our texture pre-composition that we had created earlier. Now, back in the scene setup, what we can do is select our male head and change its UV mapping to box. And now let's go to the material presets, and under the physical materials, there's one I'm going to steal really quick called Flat Color. Just drop that onto the head. This is one you can actually create fairly easy, but we're going to skip playing with those settings and just steal the one that has absolutely no shading or any specular or anything like that applied, just for the sake of time. Now, under the diffuse slot, we're going to change the preset to Custom Layer 1, and then change the diffuse color all the way to white. And that looks pretty good. Click OK. And if you haven't done so already, you need to change your opacity of your element layer all the way back up to 100%. Now, the next thing we're going to do is double-click and open up our pre-composition that has our head with the mask on it applied. And I'm just going to grab that footage, hit Control-C to copy it. Let's come back over into the head mat and paste it back in. And hit M on the keyboard, select its mask, and just delete it. So now we have our footage back in place where we need it. Let's put it below our head composition, right-click, and then change it to a guide layer. Now, what a guide layer is it's just going to only show up in the composition that it's present in. So if you were to put this pre-comp in any of these other ones we created, this layer would not follow through. It's just here for our reference now. Now, I'm going to turn off the visibility for our Element 3D layer for now. And I'm going to create a new black solid, and I'm just going to call this hair. Click OK. Now, turn off the visibility for hair, and you probably already guessed it. We're going to click the pen tool and draw a really rough mask just around our actor's hair. It's okay if we get some of his head in there as well. And I want to give it a little bit of space out and around the outside of his hair. That's definitely okay. And it's also okay if you get some of his head in there. That's also going to be fine. But that mask works just fine for now. Now hit M on the keyboard with hair selected to bring up its mask path. Click Stopwatch. And you guessed it, we're going to have to go through and hand animate this so that way it stays on the hair as best as we can get it to without having to do, too much work. My grandfather is actually an excellent woodworker and craftsman of many sorts, and he's told me that the secret to a lot of the work is being lazy where you can afford to. And I believe him wholeheartedly on that. All right, there we go. I like that quite a bit. Now what we're going to do is create another mask, and I'm just going to give it a really abstract shape and start it right down here on the bottom right side of his head. So right about here looks good. And yeah, it really can be any shape that you want. Actually, I'm going to turn back on our hair mat and solo it. And let's click this button here to toggle the transparency grid, as After Effects puts it. And we're going to change mask number 2 from Add to Intersect. So that way our hair mask only is visible where the second mask is overlapping with it. So now I'm going to select our hair, hit M on the keyboard until we can bring up the mask options for mask number 2. I'm going to go to just probably about 1 second into the composition and then click the stopwatch for the mask expansion on mask number 2 and turn it down all the way till it's almost completely invisible. If you go a little bit too far, it ends up getting negative and just undoing the whole thing, so you don't want to do that. Move forward to probably about 3/4 of the way through and turn it up all the way so that way the entirety of our hair mask is actually engulfed. Now, if we want the hair to be coming on from 2 different sources, we can actually take our first mask and bring it below the second and change it from Add to Intersect, and then change mask 2, the one that's now on top, from Intersect to Add. So now that way, if we want to, we can actually duplicate our second mask and bring it to a different point over here, and maybe even duplicate it again and bring it up to somewhere up at the top. And if we play this back, the hair is all drawing on from different
spots. Really just play around with this. Your goal is to make it look as organic as you can. The next thing to do is to grab our hair here, and we're going to pre-compose it, move all attributes to a new comp. Hair comp 1 that's a fine name. Double click on it to open it up. Now we're going to duplicate our hair solid, and for the copy on the bottom, hit M to bring up the mask options, and delete everything except for the outline of the hair. We can actually turn off the solo for both of those. Sometimes that bugs me. And now for this top copy, the one that still has all the masks on it, what I want to do is change its color from black to white. The last thing to do before being finished with the hair is with our top copy selected, the one that is now white, we're going to add an effect onto it called Roughen Edges. Change the scale down to somewhere small, maybe in the 30 range, and then the border up really high. The goal here is for it to possibly look like it was maybe burning. So what I want to do is change the evolution over time. So just the easy way is to go to the beginning of the comp, click evolution stopwatch, go to the end, change the rotation amount to something high like 20. And if you play this back, it's going pretty crazy. Now what the black is going to be used for is to set the visibility of the hair itself. So that way it lasts a little bit longer than the face. And you'll see that as we continue on with our steps. But what that means is that by the end of this, we don't want any black visible at all. And the way to fix that would be to go to our white layer, the hair one right here on top. And for the outline layer mask, we can animate it actually to go outward. So somewhere right about here, click the stopwatch. And let's go towards the end and expand it. So that way, it completely engulfs all of the black. Now we can go back into our head mat composition, and let's unsolo our hair comp and turn back on our element 3D. And let's actually put our hair comp on top of element 3D. And let's turn off our head mat composition here, this one. Or you can set it to a guide layer, but I'm just going to turn it off. This looks pretty good for now, but it's something we may want to refine later. However, I'm really excited to show you what we're going to be using this for. So let's go back into our main composition where we removed our actor's head. Let's turn back on his footage layer and put it as well as the head mat on top of everything. And then we're going to toggle the switches so the track mat is visible. And then for our footage layer, set its track mat to Luma Inverted Matte. So essentially what that is doing is it's saying at the beginning, when there is absolutely no white in our head mat composition, it's completely visible. But as it goes on and white takes over, he's starting to disintegrate. So I'm actually going to go back into our head mat composition and go to Element 3D and go to the scene setup. And one thing I did in the previous example that you can do in this one if you want is go to the Create tab and make a sphere. Let's make it relatively smaller than the head itself, just so it fits inside. And then what I want to do is add on our texture that is on the head currently to that sphere. And what we're essentially doing is just getting rid of the problem where his eyes are still visible at the end of our composition. So click OK, and that's now fixed. Now what I want to do is the exact same thing we did to the hair. I want to do it to the neck. So you know the procedure. We're going to create a new solid. I'm going to make this a black solid. I'm going to name it neck. I'm going to draw a rough mask around where the neck would be. And now let's move that over. Now we can add an effect on it called linear wipe. I'm going to point the wipe angle down and change the transition to 100%. Let's go to close to the beginning, click the stopwatch for transition completion, go forward to about the middle, change transition completion to 0. Now let's add on a roughen edges as we did before. Change the scale down to 30 and the border up to about 80. Let's select it and pre-compose it, move all attributes in this new composition. Let's duplicate it. For the bottom copy, let's delete our linear wipe. And for the top copy, let's change it from black to white. And go to the mask expansion and turn it up until the black is completely gone. And it looks something about like that. Now, if we come back over into our head mat, I actually want to put the neck comp below Element 3D. And if we go back to our main composition, what we're left with is this. So there's definitely some refining that needs to happen here. And obviously we have the burning edges and some embers and a dozen other things, but this tutorial is getting a little bit long, so I'm gonna have to finish up the rest of this in part 2. So look forward to that, and I will see you guys next time.